And so there it is. It's recording. So we're going to go ahead and get started, and I'm going to start by introducing myself and welcoming you all. For those I have not met, my name is Autumn Marshall, and I am the sponsor of Neurodivergent, which is one of CDPHE's newest employee resource groups. And before we get started, I would like to give a huge shout out to thank Brady Zelatel for her assistance today. She's sitting behind me and making sure that this is all working well. I would also like to thank the co-chairs of Neurodivergent, Jennifer Smith, Alyssa Collado, and Sherry May for their help and support. So this month we are celebrating Neurodiversity Acceptance Month, and it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Melissa Walker. She is the Director of Workforce Solutions at the Department of Personnel and Administration, directing workforce strategy across state agencies, including higher education institutions. With more than 2 decades of expertise in strategic workforce initiatives, Dr. Walker excels in developing inclusive cultures and pioneering innovative solutions for a variety of dynamic organizations. Dr. Walker identifies as autistic, a facet of her identity that informs her deep commitment to neurodiversity and inclusion in the professional landscape. And I'd just like to say that she was an integral part of creating and the original sponsor of Neurodivergent when she worked here at CDPHE prior to her leaving and going to DPA. So thank you, Melissa. And without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Melissa, and she's going to speak to us on foundations in neurodiversity, transform your workplace, enrich your culture.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for having me here today. Autumn, thank you so much. I am really excited to talk about this topic because not only is it, a part of our recognition this month, but because I think it's one of our vast untapped resources in the workplace. It's also near and dear to my heart as a person that is neurodivergent, as well as being a parent to neurodivergent children. And I suspect being a child of a neurodivergent parent as well. We like to call that the child-to-parent pipeline, as I'll talk about a little bit as we move forward. Little housekeeping, feel free to show up as you. That means camera on, camera off, use chat, raise your hand, do whatever feels best for you and what makes you most comfortable in this space. There's a ton of content that we're going to try to get through today, and I recognize that it's a lot. So if you need to, take a step back, take a moment to walk away. So for processing, again, as Autumn mentioned, this is being recorded. I've also provided a participant guide that Autumn will send out along with the slides. So the participant guide goes a little bit deeper into everything that we're going to talk about today, and also provides you with some resources that you can look at if you'd like to delve a little deeper on your own. Autumn is going to graciously send you the slides. So if you have any questions or anything, you can feel free to reach out to me as well. All right, let's jump in. So I want to kind of talk a little bit about myself in this particular space. So I was diagnosed formally in 2021. I was able to take advantage of working at an institution of higher education that had a department that did diagnoses around not only this, but multiple other types of cognitive disorders and things. And I'm going to use the medical model word for disorder there for just a second as we kind of move through what that means. The diagnoses came in 2021 when I really wanted to have something firm to reference to not only access resources, but also I knew that if I wanted to advocate from this space in order to gain credibility in certain areas, people would need to have a diagnosis in order to lend their own feelings of credibility and perspective around that. So I kind of wanted to have that checkbox. However, I was self-diagnosed in 2015. And I also want to preface this and say that self-diagnosis is 100% valid and to embrace that as well. So if you have those feelings about yourself and you've joined a few communities and social media and other places and you're like, I think this is who I am, embrace it. Self-diagnosis is absolutely valid. With that though, as I mentioned before, the child to parent pipeline for self-diagnosis and diagnoses, when my son was born in 2013, we started going through some different processes and recognized that that he is autistic, and started having those moments of like, huh, I do that. Oh, wow, I do that too. And so that led to some very real moments of kind of processing and taking in those types of thoughts, and recognizing that, hey, there's probably a real valid reason for this. One of the projects that I did before I left my previous institution, which I worked at Penn State University for about 13 years, is I put together a conference for over 3 days, a virtual conference for embracing autism in adulthood. And it was very cool because every speaker that we had was autistic. There were no neurotypical speakers, and every person that was there spoke to it from real life experience, including our non-speaking facilitators, which was awesome. The reason I mention this is because as I was coordinating this, a person who has become a dear friend to me, Tara Vance, who is the CEO of a nonprofit called Neuroclastic, leaned in one day to her camera very close, and she's like, "Melissa, you know you're one of us, right?" And for me, that was also a moment of being embraced by a community that I was hesitant to step in fully as an adult person being diagnosed. So I will also say that I am currently working in my first self-disclosed environment. I did not disclose this to my current employer at the time. I only disclosed when I came to initially CDPHE. You might have met Angelo Fernandez. He was the very first person I told when I walked into these doors, and said, "Hey, this is who I am, and this is the journey that we're on." And I have kept that disclosed moment throughout my career here at the state, including disclosing to my supervisor, my leadership, my staff, my colleagues, my peers at DPA who are also aware. It is a very interesting place to be in a self-disclosed environment. So with that being said, I want to also kind of offer you a little bit of a disclaimer before I jump into anything. And this is just mine, but kind of like boilerplate of like, I'm not an expert in all neurological conditions. I'm fairly well educated because of being in the community, because of the advocacy roles that I have. But that does not mean that I am an expert in all things. I also, when I talk about things around lived experience or the community, I'm going to use myself as an example for most spaces. I will tell you prevalent topics and prevalent consensus that comes up through the community as part of me being involved in multiple spaces around neurodiversity. But I will also say that just because something affects me one way or affects people that I know one way doesn't mean that it affects everybody one way or the same way. So just kind of throwing that out there. All right, so what we're going to cover today, we're going to try to get through all of this, but we're going to talk a little bit about what neurodiversity is, what are some of the different common forms of neurodiversity, and what neurodiversity looks like in the workplace. All right, so the definition of neurodiversity, and forgive me, this will be the only slide that I actually read, describes the idea that people experience and interact with the world around them in many different ways. There is no one right way of thinking, learning, and behaving, and differences are not viewed as deficits. The word neurodiversity refers to the spectrum of neurodivergent conditions such as autism, ADHD, dyslexia, and others. We're going to have a little bit of kind of delving into definitions about some of these different conditions. And we'll also talk a little bit about comorbidities as well. One of the things that I also want to preface is that if I don't talk about that condition here today, it doesn't mean that it's not included. So for instance, one of the things that I'm not going to delve into is PTSD. However, PTSD is recognized as a neurodiverse condition because it alters the way that the brain interacts with the world. So that's one of those things to kind of keep in mind. It's not everything we're going to talk about is not going to be all inclusive. So let's move into what is neurodiversity. And so in the late 20th century, in order to challenge some of the medical models, we have this shift, this paradigm shift from pathology to diversity. And you heard me say earlier, the medical model. And that's because oftentimes this is how we are referred to in many, many spaces. And what really happens when we utilize the medical model as a framework from which to discuss all of these topics is we tend to come at it from a deficit approach. We look at things like skills gaps, and we look at things like competence, and we look at things like social interactions, and they're all based in this medical model around how we see ourselves in typical social and other in societal norms. I mean, in that package of what we think people should and how people should, and I'm going to use air quotes around should, behave. This comes into play in a lot of different instances. And so while we do have differing levels of how neurodiversity shows up, the important thing is that if we have a framework that looks at support rather than bridging a gap, we have different ways of getting to the same goal. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that because the stance that I come from is from acceptance. A person 100% can reach the goal that they want to reach to the extent that they want to reach it, if they're given the accommodations and support to get there. And so when we stop looking at it through strictly a neurotypical lens, we have more opportunities to provide supports and resources that match a person's needs. In that space, we're talking about equity. So let's move a little bit forward here, and we will talk about how we can celebrate neurodiversity. And so I'm going to play a quick video. I'm going to try to play a quick video. So I'll hope it works. And I believe the closed captions are on, but I'll double check that as well. So let me know right away if you can't hear it.
Did you know that Sensodyne now has a clinical range?
We're going to watch an ad first.
Where you can both whiten your teeth, 2 shades, and also get sensitivity protection. It's just properly formulated from a dentist perspective. It's something that I've recommended to my patients.
I'm getting no
Neurological
kickbacks on
differences
that.
like autism or ADHD are considered to be dysfunctional disorders and disabilities under the medical model of mental health. There's too little attention given to enabling people strengths and to find a place in society that values their differences. When most of us think of diversity, we think of things like race or sexual orientation. But there's a different kind of diversity you might not know about, neurodiversity. Neurodiversity is the concept that neurological differences among people should be recognized and respected. I believe it's time for this new social movement, the neurodiversity movement, to take off. Neurodiversity is a part of our genetics and of our evolution as a species. The genes for autism and ADHD are not errors, but rather are the result of variations in the human genome that have and will continue to have advantages for society. One of the genes associated with ADHD, the DRD4 gene, is known as the novelty-seeking gene. It arrived on the human evolutionary scene over 10,000 years ago. Genes associated with autism also go back more than 10,000 years. Research suggests that genetic variants linked to autism might have been positively selected during human evolution because they contributed to exceptional memory skills, heightened perception in vision, taste, and smell, a precise eye for detail, and an enhanced understanding of systems such as animal behavior. These characteristics likely remain in the gene pool today because they are still advantageous. As a psychologist advising the parents of differently wired kids, I tell parents they have a choice between trying to change the child to fit the environment and changing the environment to fit the child. There are many different microhabitats and subcultures in our world. For an individual with autism or ADHD, finding success on their own terms may come from discovering the particular niche that fits best, the niche that allows their strengths to shine and their challenges to be minimized. Individuals with ADHD tend to thrive in situations of rapid change, variety, and that reward creativity and out-of-the-box thinking. A career as a comedian, detective, entrepreneur, journalist, actor, EMT technician, or photographer could be. I'm not saying that having autism or ADHD is easy. And I don't mean to downplay the real suffering that can be caused by having a neurodevelopmental condition, disability, or difference. But it's also time the world sees the beauty and value in brain differences. Neurodiversity might be every bit as crucial for the human race as biodiversity is for life in general. My vision is for a neurodiversity tolerant and accepting society where differences are celebrated for the depth and dimension they bring to the human condition. I want children whose brains are wired differently to be encouraged to find their niche instead of changing to fit other people's ideas of normal. Diversity in every sense makes our world a better place, and people who think differently are a huge part of that.
Right. I love that video because it's so neuroaffirming. So let's talk a little bit about what this looks like in the workforce and why does it matter. So right now, the CDC estimates that 15 to 20% of the population is neurodivergent. I will also preface that by saying that other research institutions that are outside of the United States, including Europe and Australia, are actually estimating that this number is close to 40%, especially when we're seeing multiple instances of neurodiversity showing up within the same people. Recent research through NIH is actually finding that there's such an overlap between autism and ADHD that it is more likely for people to have both than not be singularly diagnosed with one or the other. The 15 to 20% is also, it's really important to recognize that in the United States, and as this data is being reported, that it is easier for people of privilege to be diagnosed than people that do not have the same access to resources and opportunity. If we think about how our kiddos are diagnosed in school systems, recognize that most often in our priority populations, persons of color especially are going to be hit with assumptions around competence and behavior that are limited by their access to opportunity and resources. So for instance, autistic behaviors are more likely to be attributed to behavioral problems rather than having an assumption that there might be some diagnoses involved. So when we think about this 15 to 20% of the population, I think it's important for us to all recognize that that number is likely higher, but that is what we're working with right now. So if we use this 15 to 20% as a baseline, we need to consider what that really looks like in the workforce. So if you see, I have this fun little, like our little, it's not quite a Venn diagram, but our little diagram of what the workforce looks like. You'll notice that the population of neurotypical to neurodivergent is obviously skewed with these numbers, neurotypical being quite large, that, 80%. The neurodivergent, I've got it framed out at 20%. And then if you see that tiny little button right there that says self ... that is the 1 to 3% that actually disclose. Only 1 to 3% of your neurodivergent talent pool will disclose to their employer that they're neurodivergent. 1% compared to the estimated baseline of 20%. And I think that is a big part of why we need to talk about neurodiversity, especially in areas of DEI. One of the most often dismissed parts of DEI is the neurodiverse and disabled community. And I think while many organizations are making great strides, especially here at the state, there's still a ton of work that needs to be done. So when we think about the unique strengths to performance and that what neurodiverse talent brings to the organization, this is an untapped pool of resources. It's important to note that 42% of autistic individuals in the United States have never been employed. That's a statistic that is really hard to sit with. So when we think about those employment barriers, consider how you, as colleague, as peers, as hiring managers, how you are intentionally creating pathways for your neurodiverse talent. Right, let's talk a little bit about the complexity of neurodivergence. And this is very cool for me because one of the other fun statistics that I love is that neurodiversity is 83% intersected with other identities. It is the most diverse intersectional population we have within our diversity, equity, and inclusion community because Neurodivergent intersects with race, with culture, with gender identity, disability, socioeconomic status. It is generational. It intersects with sexuality and so many other facets. It is a true intersectional community and a place for all of us to show up and be allies, be vessels of support, be sponsors, be accomplices, and to lift, continuously lift each other up in many, many spaces. Because we have that intersectionality ingrained. So when we think about these identities and the variability, we have a platform of advocacy that we haven't quite tapped into to the extent that we can. And there's lots of reasons for that. Part of it is because many of us are also living with the oppressive nature of multiple aspects of the United States culture which don't necessarily presume competence in neurodiverse individuals. There is an assumption and a stigma that goes with autism. I've had a person say to me in the last year, "Oh, I don't associate you with all the negative stereotypes of autism." And that lives today, because the initial thought around neurodiverse diagnoses is a lack of competence, is the idea of being less than. And that is a continued mountain that we climb. So let's talk a little bit about some of those forms of neurodivergence. So as I said before, this isn't going to encompass everything. We're going to just talk about some common neurodivergence conditions. The first one being autism spectrum disorder. Hi, Melissa, nice to meet you. Primarily displayed there are some differences in social interaction, communication, interest, and behavior patterns. Yeah, so I definitely feel out of step most of the time. I, being late diagnosed as well, I've also masked for most of my life without even realizing it. I'll put on a different persona for different interactions. I will definitely not be my true self in spaces of where I know it's not really permitted. Because I fear judgment, I fear stigma, I fear that lack of presumed competence. And in communication, I do tend to be, and again, using myself as an example, not encompassing all autistic persons, but I do tend to be pretty direct. And I do have my common interests and I do have my behavior patterns. As we continue to kind of talk about this, I want you to think about when you consider what autism looks like. Are you leaning into an individual's behavior? Are you leaning into the experience that you've had or talking to somebody with lived experiences? Or do you all sometimes lean into stereotypical experiences that you may have encountered elsewhere? Love it. So let's talk a little bit about ADHD. I love my ADHD friends. I'm looking at you, Autumn. I love, because there is and I'll talk about the strengths that come up in the next slide. So I don't want to jump too far ahead, so let's talk about what it is. When we think about ADHD, the differences are in focusing, hyperactivity, and sometimes can be impulsive. Those are also commonly associated when people think about ADHD. These are sometimes the first things that come to mind. ADHD has a pretty well-founded diagnosis and has been shared quite, I would say, vastly throughout. Negative stereotypes, though, we tend to see, a lot of images in social media and our media and a lot of other places where, it's focused around kiddos and it's focused around, the needs that they have. And, we see negative stereotypes. The fortunate thing is that in the workforce, our ADHD colleagues are pretty awesome. And we have been able to slowly but surely start shifting that lens of what an ADHD person looks like, every day. So let's talk about dyslexia. Dyslexia is in differences in reading and writing. Most people are pretty familiar with this one. And then also OCD. Obsessive compulsive disorder is, when a person is characterized by repetitive thoughts, obsessions, behaviors, and compulsions. One of the things that, and I will tell you, this is a tiny bit of a pet peeve of mine that I had to shift for myself as well, is that terms like OCD and ADHD commonly get used in areas of, as slang. Oh, you're so OCD. Oh, I am so OCD. I have to do everything in an order. I get it. It's part of our vernacular. It's part of the social structure, but we're also doing, when we use it in everyday language where it doesn't apply to a diagnosis, is diminish its importance. And so for yourselves, and even for me, you know, if we're talking about OCD in the workplace, let's make sure that we use it in a way that is not diminishing somebody's very real experiences. And I offer that as somebody that 100% did this. Like, my husband is incredibly, like, very methodical, and I used to refer to him as OCD all the time, and he doesn't have a diagnosis for that. Should not be doing it. Yes, and absolutely. Thank you for adding that. People will say I am, who are not ADHD will say I'm ADHD. Yeah, and it's slang that diminishes the experience. I've also had somebody say in other, and I'll say this, I've had many people say in lots of different experiences, not necessarily to me, but what I've observed is, oh, we're all a little bit autistic. Like, oh, okay. Let me know how that works out for you. So, thank you so much. And I apologize. I should not be reading chat, and I try to do that as I'm talking, and I know better. I'm going to stop right now. I'm going to be good. Okay. So let's talk about why these are so cool in the workforce. So our autistic folk, we have unique strengths: attention to detail, ability to recognize patterns, deep focus on areas of interest. People that have worked with me have often found me to be like the left field thinker. I've also been called the monkey wrench thinker because I tend to be the person that sees things very far down the road, and I'm right there with, like, there's a pattern here. And I will say, if I lean into my strengths and actually can say something nice about myself for 5 minutes, I'm really good at pattern recognition and really good at seeing things as they may pop up in the future. So I tend to be an anticipatory thinker and looking for all the multiple avenues in which something could diverge as we go through, like, go down a path. ADHD, as I said, love my ADHD friends. So creative, so energetic, and 100% are they out of the box thinker. One of the best experiences of my life and my professional life is working with Autumn Marshall because of her creativity, her energy. I mean, this is a person where I would have like a half-baked idea, and she'd come back the next day with like the idea fully baked and planned out for the next 5 years. I'm like, where did this come from? And it's just her brain, because it's amazing. In my time as being an advocate and an ally in this space, I had the opportunity and the pleasure to really delve into a lot of these discussions with many colleagues that identify as having ADHD or being ADHD, and some of the best experiences. It really is. Dyslexia. The cool thing with dyslexia is that it creates different pathways for thinking as well. So you have unique perspectives into problem solving, visual thinking, complex systems thinking. And so while the strength may not be in, let's say, written communication, the verbal processing skills and the ability to think through systems and structures is off the charts. These are the people that you want doing your strategy. These are the people that you want in your graphic art spaces. It is an amazing skill set to have. The problem is that oftentimes when we create our positions, we think about our jobs, we tend to narrow our view into what we commonly ask for. Must have written excellent verbal and, or written communication skills. That can hinder and really narrow the pool of talent we bring in. When we think about OCD, I mean, come on, these are your risk analysis people. These are the folks that you want designing your project plan. These are the people that you want reviewing those Excel spreadsheets and finding that one tiny thing that you'll never see. The attention to detail, the focus, the organization, the logistical planning, I cannot stress this enough, the risk analysis and the future forward thinking. This is an amazing pool of talent that is so often left out because of that presumed non-competence, the stigma. So something to kind of consider for yourself. All right. I want to talk a little bit about some lesser known neurodiverse conditions. So let's talk about sensory processing disorder. And these often show up as comorbidities. And so that's when we have, say, a primary diagnosis of being autistic, but we also have a secondary diagnosis and or diagnoses. There can be multiple. So sensory processing disorder, experiencing difficulties in processing touch, sound, movement. This can also be environmental, too hot, too cold, too bright. Anything that comes along with sensory processing. This can also show up as can never pronounce this. Synesthesia. Sorry, I can't say it, but that's as close as I can get. In which a person will actually like hear color or see sounds. So it can show up in a lot of interesting ways. Most commonly, though, you'll see it in spaces of like, I can't regulate my body temperature, everything is too bright. I like to call the lights in my office my interrogation lights because they're bright. But it's one of those things to kind of consider when we talk a lot about, especially our autistic colleagues, we realize that there's a lot of sensory things going on. I have multiple fidgets. You can't see them because I'm hiding them from you now, but it helps. It helps when you're able to ground yourself in sensory processes as well. So, prosopagnosia, nailed it. Face blindness. This is one of those things where you have a hard time being able to recognize faces, even in familiar people. And another one I really want to touch on, and I'm saving a little space so we can talk about it a little bit, is rejection-sensitive dysphoria. This shows up most commonly in autistic and ADHD. And however, it can show up in many other spaces, especially PTSD and other trauma response-related disorders. Rejection-sensitive dysphoria is an extreme emotional sensitivity. It is a space where if you perceive a rejection, you can't move past it. It is intensely and deeply personal. This can be correlated with criticism or perceived criticism, feeling of rejection, feelings of failure. It takes a lot to process. It takes a lot to move past. And sometimes you need a buddy. You need a coping mechanism. You need to be able to therapeutically work through, but it is very real. And so if you notice that you have a person on your team that you feel like, wow, I just can't give them feedback, reframe that lens and think about it from a different perspective. Perhaps there's a different reason, and maybe we can create different supports for that. How do you give feedback? How do you broach these conversations? What methods do you use? What medium? Have you asked them how they would like to receive feedback and what that means to them? So I really wanted to touch on that for just a moment. So thank you for giving me that space. All right, as we talked about comorbidities a little bit, just in that 2 or more disorders, disabilities occurring in the same person. So we see this pretty often. So let's talk a little bit about why it's relevant for the workplace. So how do we leverage and support neurodiversity? And again, I also want to remind you, your participant guide is going to have a lot of this in there. So don't feel like if you don't get screenshots or if you don't have the slides, you'll have all of this afterwards. So the first thing, of course, is cultural inclusion. What does that mean? Really doing what we're doing here today, having the opportunity to talk about this, creating more opportunities for awareness, kind of really reframing some of those things and thinking through social norms as well as perceived notions, those biases that we have that we've picked up from our environments. Being able to have these conversations around acceptance instead of just awareness too, these are incredibly important. And it's a big part of creating an inclusive culture for our neurodiverse populations. When we think about accessibility, resources, and accommodations, thinking about the policies that we have in place for flexible work arrangements, what we do for professional development, how we have office environments, if people are required to be in the office. I mean, how are we supporting our neurodiverse populations, our neurodiverse staff, colleagues, and friends? Thinking about resiliency, it's one of those aspects that I really like to touch on a lot, because within the United States, we have concepts like, grit, bootstraps, if I can do it, you can do it kind of things. And this is just really not an equitable way to view not only spaces of DEI overall, but very much so in spaces of neurodiversity. Because the thing is that a neurodiverse person isn't a neurotypical person wrapped or trapped in a neurodiverse shell. Like if you take a pickaxe at me and crack away, I don't have a neurotypical, gooey core. This is who I am. And it means that my processes are different. My thinking is different. How I perceive the world is different. And so when people say you must make eye contact in order to be professional, I'm going to say, no, that's not a thing. So when I think about aspects of resiliency, think about the systemic stereotypes that are woven within our work practices, our implicit communities, our non-written social structures. Think about how all of that is woven in and how they're actually walls that are created to keep things as normal as possible, as ideal as possible, as relative to the dominant social norms. Eye contact. Are we making enough eye contact? Because I'm looking at the camera, which works for me, but I mean, like I can stare at any picture, so we can make some eye contact. The fun part about eye contact is because it's a social norm, we recognize it as something that I need you to look at me so I know you're listening to me. So that's really not for you, that's for me. So one of those fun little social norms to kind of think about. Leading by example, obviously, if we have leaders that are very conscious of the differences and the needs, it's not to sprinkle this on top. As one of my favorite persons in the DEI world has often said to me, it needs to be baked in at the basic levels. One of the things that I like to just very simply and in a very simplistic way say, assume that everybody is neurodivergent. Then what do? Well, you create these fun inclusive environments with like sensory tools and like rooms that are dark and other fun things that we can have every day in the workplace. Make the assumption so that we can have an environment that is led by people who want to be supportive of neurodiverse populations. One of the things that I love to talk about as we think about how we leverage and support neurodiversity is psychological safety. And so when we create an area where not only can people disclose because they feel safe to do so, but where they can fail and jump back and move forward and learn and grow and be awesome, then we create psychological safety. And that is one of those spaces where people can talk about their conditions, they can talk about what led them on that path, they can show up and not be okay, and yet still be able to move forward and be the best staff member, colleague, friend, leader that you've ever seen, because they have a safe and psychologically safe environment in which to thrive. That open dialogue, it's integral to being able to show up authentically. Be an advocate if you can. I say that saying, if you have the spoons, if you have the space, if you have the voice, and you know what, especially if you have the privilege, use your position, use your societal place, use your voice, be an advocate for change. Recognize, learn, educate, be part of the system that empowers. And finally, as a leader, as a peer, check in. What can I do? How can I help? Can you show up as who you want to show up as? Do you feel comfortable in this space? Hey, how are you feeling today? Whatever your comfort levels are, whatever their comfort levels are, check in. Be there. Let them know that it's okay. Let yourself be okay. I've often said, and many people that know me, I've said my brain needs me to ask this question because I'll perseverate. It'll be a moment I can't move past until I do. So those check-ins, they're vital. Give us the opportunity to ask those questions, to be who we are, to show up as what we need to be, because that's how we thrive. When you give us a chance to be awesome, we're awesome. All right, so that is the share that I wanted to kind of give you today, but I wanted to leave lots of space for questions if you have them. So please feel free if you want to drop some things into the chat. Or if you want to raise your hand, whatever, again, comfort levels for you.
Real quick, I am just going to read any comments that came up. There's a lot of people agreeing and feeling seen and heard, which is great. I added advocate using a trauma-informed lens, which is no shaming and blaming others. Somebody said spoons. I feel like that's really common terminology in some spaces, but uncommon elsewhere, despite it being a really useful idea. Melissa, I remember you were the first person to talk about spoons, and I literally thought that you didn't have enough silverware. Can you explain what it is can you explain spoons to people?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for that, because that definitely is one of those terms that kind of come out through the community. Although there's actually like scientific literature around it now, which is cool. So the spoons, it's very much like having a finite resource. So when you open up your silverware drawer in the morning, and this is if you've done dishes and emptied the dishwasher, which in my case may not happen, but let's just say, because executive functioning is real, you open up your drawer in the morning and you have a finite amount of spoons. In order to expend your emotional labor, your intellectual processes, your different types of thoughts and energy, and really the stuff that you need to expend throughout the day may cost you 1, 2, 6 different spoons. And when you reach the limit of your spoons, you're out. There's just nothing left. And there is no bootstrap to pull up. There is no grit to dig down into. You're just done. And what people often misunderstand about this particular metaphor is that when you're done, you're done. Then we start moving into burnout land or meltdownville, and it's a real thing. So when we utilize our spoons, and when I say if you have enough spoons to do this, it's really taking care of yourself, making sure that you are expending the energy that you have available to you and not putting yourself in a place of harm. I wanted to go back to Autumn, if you don't mind, really quick. Something that Carrie says, I struggle with terms like professional. And I agree, 100% agree, because professional is a term that is based on perception. And that perception is based on social norms, as well as traditional workplace norms that are 100% elevated by dominant social structures. So I'm right with you. It is not DEI friendly. And I'm sorry, I'll pass it back to you, Autumn.
Okay, I have a question. So somebody asks, I have been wondering, where does general anxiety disorder fall on the neurodiversity spectrum?
Yeah, absolutely. And it falls right on in there.
It does. It's in there.
Yeah, it does. Because the general anxiety disorder is one of those spaces where it does change the thought process, especially when it's escalated. And you also have to recognize that, like PTSD, general anxiety disorder will also come with triggers. So in that space, welcome to the family.
Okay, I'm going to read the next one. This work is simply inspiring. I appreciate the work you are doing to normalize neurodiversity in the workplace and identify best practices for neurospicy employees to thrive. Thanks for creating a space to be seen. Another question, wondering if anyone has any alternate synonym terminology for spoons. I just say, I'm just going to throw it out there like my gas tank. I don't have, or no more bandwidth, or my computer is shut down, my brain computer is shut down. But, straws, somebody said.
Yeah,
Somebody
absolutely.
said, I use capacity a lot, partially because I don't have to be out, or I don't have to out myself
Mhm.
about it in a way. I'm at capacity. I'm at it, or I'm exceeding capacity. That's a good one. Someone says, I personally dislike the spoon theory language. It feels too cutesy to me. And I just say, I don't have energy or capacity. My cup is full or empty. I also use bandwidth. Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't think that there's any regulation around utilizing the word spoons. Like I feel
Bit better.
fairly comfortable saying use whatever is comfortable for you. The important part is use it. You
Mhm.
advocate for yourself. That's really the message in that particular space. I love Cody says, you know, I just say I don't have energy or capacity. The fact that you're saying it, that's the important part, because it wasn't too long ago where we weren't allowed to say, and I mean allowed, let's say, let's use it as it is. We weren't allowed to show up and say, I don't have it today. I'm at 40% and 40% is my 100%. And that's what it is. And that's okay. And we don't still have permission to do that in every space, in every place, but we can get there over a course of a long time by continuing to use words like, I don't have capacity. So Cody, I'm right with you.
I have a question that's not in the chat, but I've been asked this one a few times. So looking at rejection sensitive dysphoria, what might be some of the reasoning behind that, that folks who are neurodivergent experience this? And again, with rejection sensitive dysphoria, I've never met a human in my life that was like, yay, I love being rejected. It's good times. Nobody says that ever. So but with rejection sensitive dysphoria, it's debilitating. It's like a shame spiral times 100. So I'm curious, what your thoughts are on sort of why rejection sensitive dysphoria really kind of shows up in the neurodivergent community.
Yeah, and one, I think it's twofold. One, it is a disability. It's a medically recognized condition. It has not made its way into the DSM yet. However, I will state that and to be very clear. But it is recognized in therapeutic, psychological, and research circles. So you're going to see it pop up. I would say that because of one, it being a disability comorbidity, that it shows up there. But I think it's also exacerbated by the fact that most neurodivergent people have spent their entire lives being told they're wrong. They're wrong in how they present, they're wrong in how they behave, they're wrong in how they exist. And so that builds. It builds over years because it isn't just the microaggression part, it's a macro accepted, socially endorsed aggression. You're wrong. How you behave is wrong. How you are is wrong. How you act is wrong. How you think is wrong. And so for years, this builds and it builds. And when you reach adulthood, after you've gone through a school system that has tried to train you to be neurotypical, any paper cut feels like an amputation.
That makes sense. Thank you. All right, a couple more questions we have. You mentioned neurodiversity being included in DEI. How common / rare do you think it is?
Hope, that's a fantastic question. And I'd love to get you some like hard data, which I can do if I do a little research into it. But I can tell you anecdotally that it's more common today than it was 10 years ago, but it's still not where it needs to be. Even right now, when we have disability within DEI, say departments, we still find that the focus is not extended. And so you still are fighting an upwards battle. It needs to be brought up more. And as Joy has added, it is more recent in the DEI conversation, but not every organization still has it in their DEI conversations at all. It's a slow moving needle.
Okay, the next question, or maybe, So Carrie says, I think the issue of supporting neurodiversity in the workplace is very complicated. I try as a supervisor to be very adaptive, flexible, and open to what works for my individual employees or coworkers. But that doesn't often mean the approach or acceptance from other supervisors is the same. Any tips for navigating that piece?
Carrie, I think that's really great. Not only that you're doing this, but that that you're seeing that obstacle. I often try to lean into collaborative spaces and coaching spaces in these particular instances, utilizing myself as an example or utilizing successes that I've had. But honestly, coaching has been by farthest I would say the easiest route, not the easiest, that's the wrong word, has had the most impact, I will say, so far. And forgive me for making this connection, but I also think of it a little bit as gentle parenting, as in, so, friend, how is that working out for you so far? How do you think the other person feels? How are you able to, but really asking a lot of questions and asking people to see it from a different perspective. I found that to be a little bit more helpful. Also trying to reframe things out of personal need or personal expectations versus business needs has been helpful, because that oftentimes is one of the hurdles that we find that other and even ourselves may not necessarily recognize right off the bat, because we're so ingrained into a hierarchical structure that has been in place, since the early 1900s and before, in which we consider our organizations in a way that doesn't really work for everybody. And so when we think about the system that we are ingrained in and whether or not it actually supports each other and our peers and our colleagues and our different communities, we have to stop and think, is this actually how it needs to be? And then we have to recognize the bias that we hold, because these are spaces that we're used to. So is it a personal preference or a business need? And I think, Carrie, I walked in a circle around that question, but there's not an easy answer here. I think it's an opportunity for collaboration, brainstorming, and then a little coaching.
Okay, next question is from Lena, and it says, do you have any suggestions for building in caring for neurodivergent people into our scopes of work? Thinking about building in leeway for people being at capacity or needing more time to switch between tasks, etc. But also being mindful of the fact that sometimes there are project requirements we have to hit. So yeah, kind of that balance. What are your thoughts there?
And Lena, it's a great question, and I love that you're thinking about that. Oftentimes communication is one of the best potential structures that you can put into place. That psychologically safe environment in which a person can show up and say, this is what we need to do, and this is how we need to get there, versus here is a project deadline. How can I support you in reprioritization, recognizing that you have downtime and giving people permission to show up as they are. So for instance, I'll use my example as being at CDPHE. Oftentimes there were moments of where we had many, and I know it's still the same, ongoing competing priority projects that all had deadlines that were happening like right around the same time. And recognizing that the staff, and I'll use Autumn as an example because she has disclosed and I feel comfortable doing so, recognizing that Autumn being ADHD, myself being autistic, that meant that we needed to take time for processing and planning. So we often had regular check-ins, communication check-ins of this is where I'm at, this is what I'm doing, and this is what's happening, in order to be able to pause and reflect and really say, okay, this can be reprioritized. We can drop this ball this week. It's okay. We can do this instead, and coming up with alternative solutions in that collaborative space. And so I think you've already nailed it by saying building in caring for people in our neurodivergent, spaces, those scopes of work, et cetera, by recognizing that communication is going to be key. and that you may need to have that consistent space where people feel safe to say, I'm coming in behind, or I'm having a hard time, getting through this particular process, or anything. Think about how difficult it is for a person, especially with rejection sensitive dysphoria, to be able to say, I am having a hard time. But if you have a caring, supportive environment and you can demonstrate the productivity and the awesomeness that kind of comes out of that caring, supportive environment, it can also go back to Carrie's question around navigating those pieces for showing other managers how well this can work.
I appreciate that. And to kind of build on that, I think it really speaks to kind of having that human-centered lens. And as I always say, for those of you who've been in human-centered leadership in some of those programs, I always say, remembering that we are human beings, not human doings first. And yes, there are expectations. But I think that, when possible, it's nice when you can kind of provide some structure around what those expectations are. Like, there are definitely times when things need to be followed by the book. It's an exact procedure. There's an exact deadline. There's no ifs, ands, or buts. This is the way it needs to be done. And then there's other times where it's, I don't care how you get there as long as you get here. And here's the deadline. And then sometimes there's those places in the middle where it's like, okay, here's the parameters. Okay, it needs to be a square. And it needs to be blue and green, and it can't be purple, but how you get there from there is up to you, right? So what I mean by that is really, if there's some flexibility in how people get to an outcome, allowing that when it's possible. So for example, my brain doesn't always cooperate, and there are times when my normal 8 to 6 schedule doesn't work, and I might need to take a break in the middle of the day, but then I'm going to randomly work from 7 to 9 p.m. That works for my brain, right? As long as I'm getting it done. And I also recognize that not everybody has that same flexibility. So I think when we're looking at the work that we're doing, if there's any flexibility in allowing people to kind of do things in a way that works for them, and clarifying kind of where those limits are, like this is where it needs to be versus over here is where there's more freedom, I think sometimes that can be kind of helpful.
And I mean, lean into those strengths too, because I will tell you, if you have a project that has very strict boundaries and has to be done in a certain process and has to be done a certain way, for the love of, just give it to me. Oh my gosh, I love that. For me, that's like candy and game time. I'm a big fan. I wouldn't give that to Autumn though. Autumn would murder me. So I would give her here's a project, here's your sandbox, go forth. So that's what I'm saying, lean into those strengths, just as we've done today, where we're talking about like, these are the places that you can have your neurodiverse person, if you have the opportunity and you have the accessibility to be able to apply projects or provide projects to people based on their strengths also and their passions. Oh my gosh. The amazing things that are going to happen after that are going to be wonderful. So to Autumn's point, yes, and think about how best we can show up. It's weird, but I have like very certain things that I like my creative spaces in. And like I said, you want me to fill out a form? Oh my gosh, yes, please. I would love to fill out that form. I'm going to fill out that form so good, it's going to be amazing. So okay, I know we're coming right at time. So do we have any additional last minute questions?
I'm not seeing any more questions. I'll just read the last couple of comments. So Carrie says, thanks, I agree, hard when it's a supervisory level above you or multiple steps above you that isn't open and understanding. And then Carrie says, to Lena's point, I think that's where supervisors and planners and project managers come into play. Sometimes deadlines are hard, but often I find that the deadlines are randomly selected. So if you plan in that time and flexibility, it's an easier process.
I agree. And I will tell you also, one of the biggest triggers for me was when those deadlines or outcomes would get shifted. So you thought you had everything going, you thought things were great, and then someone shifted, and I would flounder. You gave me a path and then you changed it. Stop it. It's mean. So thank you for that.
All right, well, we are right at time, so we're gonna go ahead and wrap up. Thank you so much, Melissa, for sharing your time and wisdom with us today. For those of you who are here and listening to this, I just realized this is gonna be recorded, so this part might not make sense. But I will go ahead and I will email out the slide deck from today along with the participant guide, as well as this recording. Once I get it and make sure it has closed captioning, I will put it on the Neurodivergent intranet page. So anybody who missed it, or if it was just so riveting, you just wanted to watch it again, you may do so on demand. And I really thank all of you for being here. I was really excited at how many people registered today, and want to thank you again, Melissa, for taking your lunch break to talk with us.
Yeah, absolutely. I will say, like, for my content, please share, absolutely share. I threw my email into the chat. Feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions or need anything. Honestly, yeah, I'm here for all of it.
All right, great. All right, thank you. Have a good day, everybody.